So I'm Tina Pang. I'm curator of Hong Kong visual culture at M+ Museum, and this is the new Museum of Visual Culture that is part of the West Kowloon Cultural District, due to open next year. I've been at M+ since 2014, and I'm part of a very large curatorial team that includes curators in moving image, design and architecture, as well as visual art. And just for background, it may be interesting for you to know that the West Kowloon Cultural District is a government-funded project. And so there's been a huge investment, both in terms of the building, both in terms of building the collection, but the model of the district is quite arm's length. So we're an independent authority. We have our own governance. So all employees within the museums in Hong Kong are civil servants. But it also means that they have a limited amount of flexibility in some way. And I know that there has been a lot of discussion in the past 20 or 30 years about how to remodel the museums. And so one of the government's responses to this was to create a new cultural district and to have that run in a more independent fashion along contemporary museum management and museum structure lines. So in a way, we're an experiment for Hong Kong too. I think none of us can think right now of when we can go back to wanting to get on a plane and travel halfway around the world to see an exhibition. So we can't expect other people to do that. So that has had an impact on not my work as a curator working on exhibitions, but definitely the work of our learning and interpretation colleagues. And it's really about how you connect with your audiences at a time like this. How do you make, or how do you interpret programming or exhibitions that you've been developing for 3 years? How do you shape it in a way where it addresses the things that are most concerning your audiences at that moment? So when we open in, less than a year's time, we don't know what the world will look like. And I think that having to embrace that kind of uncertainty, it's quite exciting, I think, but for an institution that needs to plan 3 to 5 years in advance of future exhibitions, it can be quite unnerving. So part of my work as a curator of Hong Kong visual culture is really to be looking at what expressions exist of certain parts of history. So what I found super fascinating, my personal background is in prehistory, actually, not prehistory, pre-modern Chinese art history. But what I've really loved about working at M+ is the mining the kind of pioneering generation of individuals who've been working in fields like architecture, graphic design, as well as visual art. And this is inevitably connected quite closely to Hong Kong's position as a space of a really very special space where there have been so many interactions, global interactions that have been specific to its identity, I think, as a former colony. And especially during that period when China was closed. So from the end of the Chinese Civil War up to the 1980s, let's say, the end of the 70s. And early 1980s. And so that's a period of tremendous cultural growth, tremendous economic growth in Hong Kong. And there were many connections between Hong Kong and Canada, partly through migration. And what I've discovered is through individual histories. There's one person I'm thinking of in particular, David Lam, who migrated to Canada in the 1960s. And that was very early, and he was part of a group of avant-garde artists working in Hong Kong, and in a way made the decision to move somewhere else and lose his position, his central position within that group of avant-garde artists, and then continued his artistic career in a very different way in Canada. So there are these very individual links with Canada, but I'm also thinking specifically about that generation during the late 1980s, early 1990s that were leaving Hong Kong pre-handover. So the anxiety about what would happen in Hong Kong around the handover and the impact of that on cultural production across the field, photography, graphic design, filmmaking, many films that are addressing these anxieties in a very different way within Hong Kong cinema, which was still very vibrant and at its height. And, you know, a lot of films touch on this transnational, these new transnational connections and anxieties. And now I think, I touched upon it before, but now I think we're entering a different period of anxiety. So it's an anxiety about contagion, it's an anxiety about political positioning. The strength of China now, I think, has complicated, the expression of that strength has complicated a lot of relationships. And I think Hong Kong is experiencing its own transition from, you know, we're halfway through the period when we fully are part of China, and so this is it's a super interesting time of how we negotiate those multiple identities. You know, in a way, my work has been really exciting because when you start to look at individual histories and you look at the connections between groups of people, and in a small place like Hong Kong, which has now 7.7 million people, it's really people that make things happen. And so these networks of individuals that span across the globe are what really interest me, and then also to find new ways in which we talk about cultural cross-pollination, these conversations between visual forms. It's not correct to talk about influence. It's very easy for us to talk about traditional Chinese cultural expressions or Western modernity. And for us, across the board within the whole curatorial team, we're just trying to find new ways in which to talk about these links between how individuals are expressing multiple influences from many different cultures, many different geographies, and individual expressions. We've been programming throughout the whole time that I've been at MPlus and building an audience base. I think the difference is once you move into a building and you have a location that people can come to interact with you, you have a different responsibility. And I think that is what function are you performing in the community specifically now? How are you addressing the concerns, anxieties? How can you communicate in a way that people don't feel that art, culture, design histories, architectural histories, moving image is disconnected from their everyday experience of life, that it can enhance what you are experiencing. It can help you understand more the way that you're experiencing what you're experiencing. And we're the first museum in Hong Kong that is not dealing only in local cultural production. So we have works from artists, architects, makers from around the world. that makes sense for this part of the world. So what our former director always used to say was it's kind of looking at the world from a Hong Kong perspective. And I think that that's what our function needs to be, is how do we address where we are, but also in relation to the rest of the world. And I think more than ever, when we're kind of doubling down on these kind of nationalistic feelings, it's really important to think of ourselves as being part of a global community.